Hey guys, tonight we're not looking at emperors or conquests, not at sculptures or aqueducts. Instead, we're diving headfirst into the eerie underworld of ancient Rome, a side of history that most textbooks skim over, either too ashamed to linger or too disturbed to look too closely. Because while Rome gave us the Colosseum, concrete, and calendars, it also gave us punishments so bizarre, so theatrical, so disturbingly creative, that they feel more like horror stories than legal penalties. So before you get comfortable, and you want to be very comfortable for this, you know the drill. Hit that subscribe button if you're into strange slices of history that slip under the radar, and make sure to let me know where you're watching from and how you stumbled across this rabbit hole. I promise you, it only gets darker from here. Now, dim the lights. Maybe put on some ambient noise in the background, something soft, something constant. You're going to want to ease into this, because our first stop takes us into the sanctified, sacred chambers of Roman religion, a world ruled not by swords or soldiers, but by silence, fire, and a terrifying devotion to the gods. Enter the Vestal Virgins. In a time when women had almost no rights and even fewer choices, there was one path that promised prestige, luxury, and near-divine status. You'd be chosen young, before puberty. You'd be trained for years. And then you'd take a vow. 30 years of chastity, isolation, and endless responsibility. Why? Because you were now a guardian of the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. And if that flame went out, so too, they believed, did the safety of Rome itself. These weren't just ceremonial figures. They were human talismans, spiritual batteries, keeping the empire humming. But here's the catch. Screw up, and Rome didn't just cancel you. They buried you. Literally. If a Vestal virgin broke her vow of chastity, the punishment wasn't exile. It wasn't even public shame. It was burial alive. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. We're talking about digging a hole in the ground, placing the accused woman inside with a small oil lamp, a crust of bread, and a flask of water, then sealing it shut. No blood was to be spilled. That would offend the gods. This way, they could kill her while technically preserving her sanctity. A divine loophole, neatly tied up in darkness and dust. Why so extreme? Because in Roman eyes, these women were not just servants of a goddess. They were the thread holding the entire cosmic order together. If they failed, Rome itself could unravel. It was superstition weaponized, law turned into legend. One misstep, and you weren't just punished. You were erased, swallowed by the earth with no ceremony, no monument, and no forgiveness. Now, you might ask, what about the man? After all, chastity requires two people to break it. But Rome wasn't exactly big on equality. The man involved, if he was even identified, might be publicly whipped or, in some cases, executed, though always far less theatrically. It wasn't about him. It was about the symbol. The purity of the Vestal was Rome's spiritual firewall. And to compromise, it was to compromise the empire's very soul. There's a story, legend, maybe, but widely repeated, of a Vestal named Cornelia. She was accused during the reign of Emperor Domitian. Before her sentence, she reportedly shouted, "Does Caesar think I've had sex with a god then? Because no mortal man touched me." It didn't matter. She was led to the field, lowered into the pit, and sealed in. Her words echoing into the dirt. Rome didn't blink. And here's the cruel irony. Being a Vestal was, in many ways, a great honor. These women had privileges no other Roman women could dream of. They could own property. They had seats of honor at public games. They rode in carriages usually reserved for the elite. They could even pardon prisoners with a single word. But all of that power balanced on a knife's edge. One rumor, one accusation, and your palace turned into a tomb. That was the deal. You were chosen by the gods, or at least by the high priest. You lived apart. You wore white. You kept the flame burning. And if it flickered for even a moment, so did your life. This wasn't just about control. It was about fear, about the performance of devotion, about reminding everyone that Rome's gods were watching, and they didn't forgive easily. So if you're ever feeling overwhelmed by your job, just remember, At least your boss isn't threatening to bury you in a hole for a minor workplace violation. Unless your office is run by ancient Roman law, in which case, good luck. But we're just getting started. This is just the first step into Rome's brutal theater of punishment. Next, we'll look at what happened if you broke not a vow, but the ultimate familial bond. Stay tuned. The sack is waiting. Section 2. Now that we've crawled out of the suffocating silence of a Vestal's underground tomb, let's turn our gaze to something even more surreal. Something that feels pulled from the fevered imagination of a horror novelist, rather than the stone-cold records of Roman law. Because if Rome had a talent for anything, aside from conquest and engineering, it was symbolic punishment. And nowhere is that more grotesquely illustrated than in the penalty known as pena culiae, the punishment of the sack. Let's set the scene. You've done something truly unforgivable in Roman society. Not just a betrayal of the law or the gods, but something that shattered the foundational hierarchy of the family. You've killed your father. Now, Rome didn't just see this as murder. Patricide wasn't just a crime, it was cosmic treason. The father was the miniature emperor of the household, the paterfamilias, the one to whom everyone else owed obedience and respect. Kill him, and you didn't just break the law, you broke Rome. So what did they do to you? First, they tied your hands behind your back. Not for control, but for humiliation. Then came the sack. Not a simple bag, not a linen sheet, but a massive, heavy, stitched leather prison. And it wasn't just for you. Oh no, Rome believed in symbolism. They believed in poetry, even in death. So they added 4 companions. A dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. Yes, you, a convicted patricide, were sewn into a sack alongside 4 live animals, each one chosen not randomly, but with metaphor in mind. The dog represented the loyalty you lacked. The monkey stood for chaos and mockery. The snake, deceit. And the rooster? Some say it was there to mark the passage of time, the dawn of your destruction. Others think it symbolized betrayal that crows at the break of moral law. Either way, it wasn't a comforting presence. Once sewn in, alive and likely panicking with your wild roommates, you were dragged to a river. The sack was tossed in, and with it any hope of escape. Inside, the chaos erupted. The snake writhed in panic. The monkey screamed and clawed. The dog barked, bit, thrashed. The rooster flapped and pecked blindly. You were trapped in a thrashing, hissing, screeching cyclone of rage and symbolism, each moment a reminder of what you did and what you represented. It was a death of confusion, of claustrophobia, of raw, frantic animal violence. And it was precisely designed to be so. Rome didn't just want you to die. They wanted your punishment to be a performance, a lesson, a dark fable made real, sewn in leather and dropped in the Tiber. And what's especially eerie, this wasn't a punishment used regularly. It was rare, reserved, deployed only when Rome really wanted to make a statement. But when it was used, it was unforgettable. It was theatrical, and it was terrifying. Historians debate the origins of pena culiae. Some suggest it began in the early Republic. Others argue it took shape later, under emperors who enjoyed their justice with a side of showmanship. What they do agree on is that it wasn't about justice in the modern sense. It wasn't about deterrence alone. It was about Roman identity. It was about power and fear stitched into leather and stuffed with nightmares. Imagine being in that sack. No light, no room, just fur, feathers, scales, teeth, and claws. You're being trampled, bitten, strangled. The monkey screeches. The dog thrashes. The snake coils around your leg. The rooster claws blindly at your face. And all the while, water seeps through the seams of the sack, cold and rising, pressing into your lungs. You're not just dying. You're being unmade, turned into a symbol of disorder, swallowed whole by chaos and current. And here's the twisted genius. No one watching could forget what they saw. This wasn't a hanging. It wasn't a sword to the neck. It was a myth unfolding in real time. The message was clear. Break the deepest code of Roman society, and you don't just suffer. You vanish in a whirlwind of beasts and water. You are unworthy even of a clean death. You think about crime and punishment today, courtrooms, appeals, quiet executions. Then you look back and realize Rome didn't hide its horror. It displayed it. It choreographed it. And it made damn sure that even if you forgot the names, you never forgot the imagery. So the next time your dad forgets your birthday or tells a painfully bad joke, take a deep breath and be grateful. Because in ancient Rome, patricide didn't mean family therapy. It meant sack time with the serpent circus. And we're still just warming up. We've gone from silence in the earth to screaming in leather. But what happens when death becomes a symbol itself? When a cross, the most brutal punishment of them all, gets turned upside down. In the next section, we flip the script, literally. Section 3. By now, you've seen Rome's taste for symbolism. It wasn't enough to kill you. You had to mean something while dying. Your punishment had to whisper through generations, echo in the marble corridors of the Senate, burn itself into the memories of terrified citizens passing by. Rome didn't just want justice, it wanted a message. So, what better canvas for that message than the most infamous execution method in human history? Crucifixion. Let's not mince words. Crucifixion was hell on earth. It wasn't about speed. It wasn't about mercy. It was slow, theatrical agony. A punishment Rome reserved for the worst of the worst. Or, more precisely, those they wanted to be seen as the worst. Criminals, slaves, rebels, traitors, anyone who dared challenge the empire or its divine order. But leave it to Rome to innovate even on something as hideous as this. Enter the inverted crucifixion. Yes, crucified upside down. It's hard to wrap your head around. Crucifixion itself was already as brutal as it gets, an excruciating cocktail of asphyxiation, blood loss, and public humiliation. You were nailed to a wooden beam, sometimes tied as well. You hung there, gravity slowly tearing your body apart. Breathing became a labor. Every breath scraped against your shattered ribs. Crows watched from nearby roofs. And crowds watched too, jeering, gossiping, eating olives like it was a street performance. But flip the body, and the torture changes entirely. Now, your head hangs lower than your feet. Blood rushes straight to the brain. Vision blurs. The strain on your muscles inverts. Breathing, already a nightmare, becomes nearly impossible. Every movement sends a cascade of pain through your skull. Your face swells. Your eyes might rupture. It's less crucifixion, more internal implosion. And why would they do this? Sometimes it was pure cruelty. Rome had a talent for escalating the spectacle. But more often, it was symbolic. Take the most famous case, St. Peter, one of Jesus' 12 apostles. According to tradition, when he was sentenced to be crucified by Emperor Nero, Peter made a request: "Crucify me upside down." Why? Because he didn't consider himself worthy to die the same way Jesus did. A humble, harrowing request, and Rome, never one to deny a good narrative beat, complied. So they did it. They flipped the cross. To Peter, it was reverence. To Rome, it was pageantry. The crowd didn't see a martyr. They saw a man turned into a message. Humiliation stacked on top of death. Rome had taken the symbol of crucifixion and twisted it, not just to kill, but to redefine what death could mean. And here's the dark irony. That upside-down cross, once a sign of humility, would later be twisted again by time. Horror movies, metal bands, conspiracy theorists, they all grabbed it, stripped it of its origin, and repackaged it as a satanic symbol. But in the dirt of ancient Rome, it was about reverence, about dying differently, about trying to keep a sliver of dignity while nailed to a slab of state-sanctioned terror. Because that's what crucifixion really was. It wasn't just death. It was degradation. You were stripped naked. Yes, naked. Not the polite fig-leafed versions in paintings. The real thing. You were displayed like a broken machine. You didn't just die. You decomposed publicly. Birds pecked. Insects swarmed. People passed by on errands. It was a warning nailed to wood. And the location mattered. Crucifixions weren't hidden away in prison yards. They were out in the open, on roadsides, on hills. Somewhere visible. Somewhere symbolic. A crossroads of shame, visible from miles. Look, Rome was saying, this is what happens when you oppose us. Sometimes it wasn't even the physical pain that broke people. It was the humiliation. The fact that everyone saw you, that your friends turned their faces away, that your enemies smiled, that even your own body betrayed you as it collapsed inch by inch. And yet, despite all of that horror, the inverted crucifixion worked as a narrative. It became a piece of religious iconography, a symbol of humility and sacrifice, stolen right out of Rome's darkest playbook. But for the Romans, it wasn't about the spiritual. It was about the theatrical, about sending a message that couldn't be erased. Step out of line, they said, and we won't just kill you. We'll turn your death into a story, and we'll make sure people tell it for centuries. So the next time you hear the phrase crucified upside down, don't think metal album cover. Think Roman execution chamber. Think blood in your skull and fire in your lungs. Think of a city so obsessed with dominance that even death was choreographed to send a ripple through time. But if you think that's as cruel as it gets, think again. Because Rome didn't just punish individuals. Sometimes it punished entire groups, entire units. Soldiers who broke the code weren't just reprimanded. They were forced to turn on each other. And coming up next, we'll explore the most psychologically twisted group punishment Rome ever devised. It's called decimation, and it made betrayal personal. Section 4. You've seen Rome punish the pious with suffocating silence and the rebellious with public horror. You've seen them turn individual guilt into spectacle. But what happens when failure isn't tied to a single person? When an entire unit, a brotherhood of soldiers, is seen as guilty of cowardice, betrayal, or mutiny? Rome had an answer, and it was as cold, calculating, and shattering as you'd expect. It was called decimation. Now, when you hear the word decimate today, you probably think of destruction, maybe even total annihilation. But the original Roman meaning? Far more specific and far more chilling. It meant killing 1 in every 10. Let that settle in for a second. You're a Roman soldier. You and your unit have just been accused of retreating in battle or mutinying against a superior. Maybe you turned your back at the wrong moment. Maybe you hesitated. Or maybe the commander just needed to make an example. Whatever the reason, you and your fellow soldiers are lined up in rows. And the order is given. You're not all going to die, just 10% of you. But here's the twist. You're going to kill each other. The process begins with lots, random, impersonal, brutal. Every 10 men draw. The unlucky 1 becomes the target. The remaining 9? Executioners. They beat him to death with clubs, stones, whatever they can find. No swords, no quick death, just blunt force and broken bones. The man you shared rations with yesterday, the one who helped you fix your sandals, who covered your flank in the last ambush. You're now driving a rock into his skull. Why? Because Rome believed that fear of your own brothers would do what patriotism couldn't. If the idea of disappointing the state didn't keep you in line, maybe the fear of being bludgeoned by your own unit would. The message was simple. Fight for Rome, or your friends will bury you. And make no mistake, decimation wasn't just a punishment. It was psychological warfare. It turned brother against brother. It ensured that even if you survived, the bonds holding your unit together were burned. Trust was replaced with trauma. Comradeship shattered into paranoia. And it didn't end with the killings. The survivors, the 9 who did the beating, weren't off the hook. They were stripped of rations. Barley replaced wheat. A deliberate downgrade. The Roman version of "we're disappointed in you." They were forced to camp outside the fortified walls, exposed to the elements and danger. It was Rome's way of saying, we don't trust you anymore. Earn it back. This wasn't some fringe punishment either. Rome used it multiple times throughout its long military history. One of the most infamous cases came under Marcus Licinius Crassus, the ultra-wealthy general who shared power with Julius Caesar and Pompey. After his forces suffered a humiliating defeat during the Spartacus slave revolt, Crassus needed to remind his troops what was at stake. So he ordered decimation. Men were clubbed to death by their friends, their corpses left as cautionary tales. Morale didn't improve. It solidified. Discipline wasn't earned. It was carved into flesh and memory. And this wasn't even always about cowardice. Sometimes it was used for minor insubordination. Backtalk. A delay in obeying orders. The message was always the same. The empire doesn't just punish the guilty, it punishes everyone close to them. Proximity was peril. What's so disturbing about decimation is how impersonal it is. The lots are random. The execution is mandatory. There's no trial, no appeal, just probability and pressure. And in that way, decimation became the purest form of Roman justice. Blind, efficient, and unforgettable. Think of modern military punishments. Demotions, discharges, maybe a court-martial. Rome said, let's roll dice on your life and let your friend decide how hard to swing. And here's the lasting horror. It worked. Roman soldiers were some of the most disciplined in history. They marched further, fought longer, and rebelled less than almost any other army of the ancient world. Why? Because at the edge of every mistake wasn't just death, it was personal betrayal. Rome didn't need to keep you in line. They made sure you kept each other in line. So the next time your boss calls for a team-building exercise, be glad it's just a PowerPoint and not a leather pouch of marked stones. Because Rome didn't need motivational speakers. It had decimation. And if you think standing in a field while your best friend draws the death lot is the worst it can get, think again. Rome didn't always go for group punishment. Sometimes it was stillness they craved. Total silence. Absolute paralysis. Because next up, we're strapping a fork to your throat, stabbing your dignity, and seeing how long you can survive without moving a muscle. Section 5. If the last punishment, decimation, was about tearing camaraderie apart, the next one is about breaking the individual from the inside out. No blood, no spectacle, just a simple tool, some iron, and an agonizing stillness that feels like eternity. Let's talk about the fork of heretics, a punishment so bizarre, so psychologically cruel, and so understated in its execution that it often gets overlooked. But make no mistake, it wasn't just painful, it was genius-level torment disguised as restraint. Picture it, a metal rod. Nothing fancy, just a forked instrument a little longer than your forearm, with two sharp prongs on either end. Now, imagine one end of this rod is placed under your chin. The other? Dug right into your upper sternum, just above the heart. The result? You can't move. You can't even tilt your head. You can't nod. You can't look around. You can't rest. And if you do, the metal drives into your throat or your chest, or both. It's not instantly lethal. It's not even immediately gory. And that's the point. The fork of heretics wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was meant to exhaust you, to humiliate you, to drain your body, your mind, your willpower, all without spilling a drop of blood. In many ways, it was the perfect Roman punishment. Silent, symbolic, and utterly devastating. This instrument became widely used in the later Roman Empire, when heresy and religious deviation weren't just frowned upon. They were hunted. If you challenged the authority of the church or the emperor, or worse, both, you might find yourself on the receiving end of this iron verdict. And you wouldn't be alone. Blasphemers, witches, suspected pagans, liars, and even political dissenters could be fitted with one of these. Here's how it went. You'd be fastened with the fork around your neck, secured with a collar, sometimes chained to a post or left standing in a public square. The rule was simple. Don't move. Try to speak. The fork stabs you. Try to sleep. It stabs you. Nod in agreement. Stabbed. Shake in fear. Stabbed. It wasn't just painful. It was a trap made of your own instincts. And it didn't even look especially dangerous. That was part of the cruelty. People walking by might not even understand what was happening. They'd see a man standing still, maybe sweating, maybe trembling, eyes wild with strain. No screams, no blood, just a human statue slowly losing control. In some cases, victims were left like this for hours. In others, days. You weren't given a chair. You weren't allowed to sit or lean. Every second was spent balancing your entire body's impulses against two sharpened points of iron. And if that wasn't theatrical enough for you, Rome added flair. Some forks had Latin inscriptions etched into the metal. Phrases like, "I am guilty," or "I renounce my heresy," engraved onto the very thing that kept you silent. Your guilt wasn't just proclaimed. It was branded into your suffering. It wasn't about repentance. It was about performance. And as cruel as it was, It wasn't even considered one of Rome's worst punishments. No lions, no whips, no dismemberment. Just a device so simple, so mechanically efficient, that it turned the act of not moving into a high-stakes game of survival. Let's think about the psychological toll. Your body begins to tremble. Muscles twitch involuntarily. Fatigue sets in. Hunger creeps up, but you can't lower your head. You can't rest it. You can't even slump. Every involuntary movement risks impalement. Every moment is a contest between your biology and your will. And then there's the silence. No cries, no moaning, because every sound, every vibration risks setting the fork off. That silence becomes your prison. You're locked inside your own body, a prisoner of stillness, condemned by posture. The fork turned human behavior into a weapon against itself. You didn't need a lash or a lion to make someone suffer. You just needed 2 inches of sharpened metal and a public square. That's what made the fork of heretics so sinister. It wasn't just a device, it was a philosophy, a statement that even your smallest actions could betray you. That Rome didn't need to beat you to break you. All it needed was to make stillness fatal. And while this punishment eventually faded out of Roman use, its legacy bled into medieval Europe, where it was adapted and embellished. But Rome laid the blueprint. So the next time you're stuck in a stiff meeting or trying to hold still during a sneeze, remember this. In ancient Rome, moving an inch too far could literally mean stabbing yourself in the throat. But hold that image, because if stillness was agony, movement wasn't much better. Coming up next, we're climbing to the top of a cliff, standing beside a traitor, and watching Rome throw them off like broken furniture. Because the next punishment wasn't quiet, it was gravity at its most symbolic. Section 6. We've seen Rome bury people, burn them, bind them in sacks, and force them into statues of flesh and will. But what if the empire didn't want to torture you slowly? What if they just wanted you gone, utterly removed, physically and symbolically? No lingering, no blood-soaked arena, no iron fork. Just one brutal gesture, one theatrical fall, one sharp, unyielding stop. Enter the Tarpeian Rock. Forget the quiet efficiency of modern execution. Ancient Rome had its own version of the unfriend button, and it involved gravity, spectacle, and a cliff with a backstory as jagged as its edge. The Tarpeian Rock wasn't just a natural formation. It was a death sentence carved into stone, a place where traitors met their end not with dignity, but with a scream and a plummet. Located on the southern face of the Capitoline Hill, just a short stroll from the Roman Forum, the Tarpeian Rock stood as a constant, looming reminder: betray Rome, and Rome will throw you away. Literally, the rock takes its name from a woman, Tarpeia, and her story sets the tone for everything that followed. According to legend, Tarpeia was a Roman maiden who betrayed her city to the invading Sabines. She promised to open the gates in exchange for what the enemy wore on their arms, thinking she'd receive golden bracelets. But the Sabines, ever the literalists, crushed her with their shields instead, fulfilling the deal in the most punishing way possible. Her body was discarded from the cliff, and the rock, it took her name and her legacy. From that point on, the Tarpeian Rock became more than just a cliff. It became Rome's statement on betrayal, a place where the state's disapproval turned into an unceremonious plunge. Traitors, corrupt officials, perjurers, and criminals who had managed to truly offend the Roman state were marched through the city, stripped of dignity, often of clothing, sometimes paraded as crowds jeered and threw insults. And then, without trial in some cases, they were escorted to the edge of the rock. There was no ritual, no final words carved in stone. Just a push, a brief silence, then a crash. The drop itself was about 80 feet. Not high by modern skyscraper standards, but high enough to kill, or, at the very least, maim so badly that survival would be short-lived. The jagged rocks below weren't merciful, and if the fall didn't do the job, executioners sometimes ensured the work was finished quietly and efficiently. What made this punishment so terrifying wasn't just the death, it was the removal. The condemned weren't buried in honor graves. Their names were often erased. Their deaths were sudden, final, and public. This was state deletion via gravity. And the symbolism? It was rich. The Capitoline Hill was the spiritual heart of Rome. The temple of Jupiter, the king of the gods, sat just a stone's throw away from the execution site. So when someone was thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, it wasn't just about law, it was about divine judgment. You had offended the city, the gods, the universe. And so, you were expelled from it all. Sometimes crowds gathered, sometimes they didn't. But the message remained: Rome sees you. Rome judges you. And Rome has no use for traitors who cling to ledges. In many ways, the Tarpeian Rock was the antithesis of the Roman arena. It wasn't about extended suffering or prolonged humiliation. It was about sharp, decisive rejection. You didn't get lions. You didn't get a trial. You got a walk, a ledge, and a final goodbye delivered by gravity. The punishment wasn't reserved for mass criminals either. Even high-ranking officials could find themselves on the edge. Senators, military leaders, judges. If you were convicted of treason or some public disgrace, your status didn't save you. It only made the fall more symbolic. The higher you stood, the harder you fell. And while other punishments faded with time, the Tarpeian Rock endured. Even as the empire expanded, even as executions grew more elaborate, the cliff remained. A classic, simple, brutal, effective. No execution device. No guards needed. Just gravity and the will of the state. So next time you hear someone say, they really threw him under the bus, remember, Rome threw people off cliffs. No metaphor. No euphemism. Just a long drop and a lesson carved in limestone. And if you're thinking, surely it doesn't get worse than being hurled to your death by the very people you served, brace yourself. Because next, we step into the arena. The roaring Colosseum, the crowd, the roar, the lions, and the kind of punishment where you didn't just die, you performed it. Section 7. We've marched with traitors to the edge of the Tarpeian Rock and watched them fall to a brutal, symbolic end. But now we enter the most infamous venue for Roman punishment, the theater of terror, the blood-stained arena where death wasn't just a sentence. It was a show. Welcome to the Colosseum. Welcome to damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This was Rome at its most unapologetically theatrical. The Colosseum wasn't just a place for gladiator duels. It was a killing ground for criminals, prisoners of war, rebels, and religious dissenters. Anyone the empire wanted to make an example of. But unlike crucifixion or the Tarpeian Rock, this punishment wasn't about swiftness or symbolism. It was about spectacle. Imagine waking up in a cold stone cell. You're not told when you'll be taken, only that you've been condemned ad bestias. You don't know what animals they've prepared. Lions? Leopards? Bears? Maybe something worse. But you know one thing. You won't be leaving the arena alive. You're not handed a weapon. You're not given armor. Sometimes you're not even given clothes. And as the sun rises and the crowd gathers, you're led into the blinding light of the amphitheater. 50,000 Romans, shouting, laughing, betting, snacking, all here to see you die. But death was only half the performance. Rome didn't simply throw people to wild animals like tossing scraps to dogs. No, they dressed it up. They gave it a theme. One prisoner might be dressed as Orpheus, serenading a fake lyre while lions were released. Another might be tied to a mock rock, dressed as Prometheus, while trained birds pecked at his flesh in mythological reenactment. The Romans turned execution into morality play. Justice delivered in costume. It was death by narrative. This wasn't always reserved for hardened criminals either. Political dissidents, minor rebels, thieves, and, most famously, early Christians. People who refused to honor the emperor as divine. People who prayed to the wrong god at the wrong time in the wrong place. All could find themselves paraded into the arena, their deaths choreographed to tell a story. Asterisk Rome rules. Defiance dies. Asterisk. And the beasts? They weren't always hungry, not at first. So Rome got creative. Animals were starved beforehand, teased, poked with heated irons, agitated to ensure that when the gates opened, what emerged wasn't a creature. It was a frenzy of teeth and claws and wrath. You might be wondering, did anyone survive? Rarely. This wasn't a contest. This wasn't sport. It was designed to be fatal. If by some miracle a person managed to avoid death, the crowd might demand more animals. Or the guards would finish the job. You weren't meant to win. You were meant to warn. And the crowd? Oh, the crowd loved it. For many Romans, this was normal. An afternoon outing, a break from work, something to watch before dinner. The same way we treat sports or movies, they treated execution. Vendors sold bread and wine. Children sat on laps. Senators cheered. The emperor watched. What does that say about a society? The Colosseum was more than architecture. It was Rome's message to the world, carved in stone and written in blood. We are powerful. We are eternal. And we will destroy you with performance. And yet, not everyone feared this fate. Early Christians, especially, began to embrace it. Their deaths became acts of defiance. Their willingness to die without renouncing their faith turned their final moments into testaments. What was meant to humiliate them became their legacy. And that frustrated Rome even more. You want to know how powerful this punishment was? It stuck around, even as the empire shifted, even as new emperors rose and fell. The practice of damnatio ad bestias remained, because it worked. It terrified. It entertained. It reinforced the idea that Rome could end you not just physically, but publicly, brutally, and with flair. The Colosseum echoed with screams, not just from the condemned, but from animals, from crowds, from metal gates grinding open to release death. The sand soaked up blood. The stories were retold for generations. And for every person dragged into that arena, there were dozens more who watched and thought, asterisk, not me. Not ever, asterisk, because in Rome, law was not just written, it was performed, and those performances left no room for subtlety. But what if the state wanted something more elegant? What if you weren't a criminal, but a noble? A senator? Someone whose death might cause unrest if done too publicly? Well, Rome had a solution for that, too. Coming up next, death with dignity, or at least the illusion of it. Forced suicide, where Rome didn't execute you. It simply invited you to do it yourself. Section 8. After the roar of the arena fades, after the blood-soaked sand is swept clean and the gates of the Colosseum creak shut for the night, Rome turns inward. Quieter, subtler, but no less deadly, because not everyone could be thrown to lions or hurled from cliffs. Some men were too powerful, too connected, too dangerous to kill publicly. But Rome always found a way. When you were too noble to execute, too elite to disgrace, Rome didn't kill you. It handed you the knife. This is the story of forced suicide, a punishment that disguised execution as choice, an illusion of dignity offered with the sharp edge of inevitability. Let's set the scene. You're a senator, a general, maybe even a close friend to the emperor. You've been accused of treason or corruption, or perhaps just falling out of favor. The charges might be real. They might be fabricated. Doesn't matter. What matters is the quiet knock on your door, the scroll unrolled, the imperial seal, and the message inside. Take your own life, or we'll do it for you. There's no courtroom, no mob, no shouting, just a deadline. This wasn't about mercy. It was about optics. Rome, particularly under emperors like Nero and Domitian, understood the delicate balance between terror and theater. Killing a noble outright could spark unrest. But if that noble chose death, if he bathed, dressed, gave a final speech, and slid his wrists in a warm tub with his family nearby, it looked less like murder and more like a tragic conclusion. A footnote, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. It was execution by suggestion. The most famous example? Seneca the Younger, philosopher, playwright, and advisor to Nero. Once powerful, once respected. But when Nero's paranoia grew and enemies needed eliminating, Seneca received the letter. Not an order, a request. Kill yourself. And he did. According to Tacitus, Seneca calmly said goodbye to his friends. He opened his veins. When the bleeding was too slow, he tried poison. When that failed, he climbed into a hot bath, hoping the heat would speed things up. Still, death came slowly, painfully, but he never screamed, never begged. Because the real punishment wasn't just death, it was being watched while dying, knowing that every moment was performance. And Rome adored a performance. Sometimes, suicide was staged in the person's own home. Other times, they were moved to a prepared villa, offered clean linen, scented oils, and wine. Everything needed to die with grace. In rare cases, poets and scribes were brought in to record the final words. Some turned the act into a defiant gesture, others into philosophical reflection. But all of them knew there was no choice. Refuse to die? Rome wouldn't beg. They just drag your family into it. Assets seized, children exiled, your name blackened, erased from memory. Suicide wasn't just self-destruction, it was protection. For your legacy, for your loved ones, for a shred of control. That's the twisted genius of forced suicide. It looked like autonomy, but it was Rome pulling the strings all along. And it wasn't limited to the paranoid reigns of bad emperors. Even respectable rulers like Augustus or Trajan permitted it. Because the point wasn't cruelty, it was containment. A dead man can't stir rebellion. A man who kills himself can't claim martyrdom. He just disappears. But here's what makes this punishment uniquely Roman. It blended Stoic philosophy with state violence. The Romans admired calm in the face of death. They believed virtue was proven in suffering. So to take your life, cleanly and without protest, was considered noble, even admirable. Rome turned death into a moral test, and failure meant more than dying. It meant dying wrong. And sometimes the death wasn't clean. Veins didn't open. Poison didn't work. Soldiers had to step in. And when that happened, the illusion cracked. Everyone knew it was a show, but most played along. Because in Rome, even dying was about how you did it. With stoicism, with silence, with style. You weren't just dying for your crime. You were dying for Rome's image of itself. And once it was over, maybe you were given a quiet burial. Maybe a statue survived. But usually, your name was whispered. Your writings burned. You became a lesson to others. So the next time someone says, at least he died on his own terms, remember, in ancient Rome, even your final breath might have been scripted by the state. But not all deaths were so clean. Some are messy, public, grotesque, performed not in the quiet halls of a villa, but in the screaming streets, on instruments designed to slice, tear, and break the human body. Because up next, we meet the wooden donkey, where your own weight becomes your torture and dignity is flayed away one slow splinter at a time. Section 9. We've sat in marble villas watching nobles bleed out in perfumed tubs. We've witnessed the illusion of dignity wrap around death like a velvet curtain. But not all of Rome's punishments were designed for the elite. Some were designed for humiliation, raw, public, and unforgettable. Enter the wooden donkey. Now don't let the name fool you. This wasn't some child's toy or novelty contraption. The wooden donkey, also known in later periods as the Spanish donkey, was a torture device. And it was as primitive as it was horrifying. Think of a tall wooden triangle, its top edge razor sharp. Then imagine being forced to sit on it. Not sideways, not comfortably, straddling it, as if it were a saddle made of pain. This punishment weaponized gravity. Victims, usually thieves, soldiers who disobeyed orders, or women accused of adultery, were stripped naked. Then they were hoisted up and lowered onto the donkey, legs straddling the edge. The weight of their own body pressed them down. The sharper the edge, the worse the pain. And just in case gravity wasn't fast enough, guards would add weights to the victim's ankles, pulling them downward. More weight, more pressure, more tearing. Muscles separated, tendons strained, skin split. There were no ropes to hold you upright. No handrails. You were stuck, naked, in agony, displayed like a grotesque banner in the town square. The longer you sat, the deeper the damage. There are accounts of the donkey causing permanent injuries. Torn groins, shattered pelvises, ruptured blood vessels, and sometimes, though not always, death. Because here's the Roman twist. Death wasn't even the goal. Humiliation was. This wasn't just punishment, it was performance. Crowds gathered, laughed, mocked. The victims' cries weren't muffled. They were part of the experience. It was a spectacle that reminded everyone watching, disobey, and this is what you become. A spectacle of suffering. And let's be clear, this wasn't a fringe punishment. Rome used it liberally. Soldiers who refused orders, slaves who spoke out, women accused by their husbands. Anyone the state, or an individual in power, wanted shame could find themselves straddling this brutal wedge. Even worse, this punishment was often paired with marching. Yes, some victims were placed on mobile wooden donkeys, mounted on carts or platforms, paraded through city streets while bleeding and screaming, their bodies bouncing with every cobblestone. Children threw fruit. Adults hurled insults. The pain wasn't just physical, it was social annihilation. And because Rome loved symbolism, the donkey itself wasn't chosen at random. The real animal, known for stubbornness and servitude, became a metaphor. The state's message was simple. You acted like a beast, so you'll be treated like one. A jackass on a jackass. How poetic. Some versions of the donkey were modified to be taller or sharper, depending on the severity of the offense. Others had iron edges or were heated with coals underneath. Variations on a theme of agony. And if you think the punishment ended once you were taken down, think again. Many victims couldn't walk afterward. Some never had children again. For women especially, the damage was intimate and lasting. And that's exactly what Rome wanted. A punishment that lingered, that followed you, that marked you. Because sometimes the most effective control isn't death. It's shame. Visible, unforgettable, inescapable shame. You might be wondering, why would anyone allow this to happen to themselves or a family member? The answer is, they had no choice. The law was absolute. The accuser only had to be of higher status or present a strong enough claim, and the sentence could be passed. There wasn't always a trial. In some cases, the accusation itself was enough. And as cruel as this punishment was, it didn't disappear with Rome. Versions of the wooden donkey resurfaced in medieval Europe, during the Spanish Inquisition, even in early modern armies, used as a disciplinary tool. But it was Rome that refined it, Rome that made it theatrical. They didn't just want to punish. They wanted people to watch, to remember, to fear. So the next time someone says, "Ride the donkey," like it's a joke, know this. In ancient Rome, that phrase meant splinters, screams, and scars that lasted a lifetime. But if you think this is where the cruelty stops, if you think we've reached the bottom of the barrel, think again. Because what if Rome didn't just want to break your body or your pride? What if it wanted to label you forever? Coming up next, branding, where your crime wasn't just remembered, it was burned into your face. Section 10. You've heard of shame. You've heard of pain. You've heard of punishment. But now we arrive at a punishment that fuses all three into one permanent scar. No way out. No way back. Because when the Roman state wanted everyone to know what you'd done, forever, they turned to branding. Not metaphorical shame. Literal, searing hot metal-to-flesh shame. The kind you carried to the grave and beyond. This wasn't some casual warning. This was a life sentence etched into skin. And the most common place to mark? The face. Let's be clear, branding wasn't exclusive to Rome. Other ancient cultures practiced it, but Rome made it systematic, institutional, bureaucratic even. In the Roman world, branding was punishment for a host of crimes: desertion, theft, rebellion, slave escape, false testimony. Each crime had its own shorthand, its own letters burned into the flesh, especially on the forehead or cheeks. Branded letters acted as your permanent ID badge. Only this one didn't get you into clubs. It locked you out. Let's say you were a runaway slave. You might receive the letters FUG, short for fugitivus, right between your eyes. Every Roman who saw you knew. This one ran. He's a problem. He can't be trusted. If you're caught stealing, you might get fur for furax, thief, branded for life. It didn't matter if you reformed. Didn't matter if you repented. The mark was there. Proof of your disobedience. A red-hot reminder of who had the power and who didn't. The branding iron was heated until it glowed white. Victims were held down, sometimes by force, other times by fear. There was no anesthesia, no fanfare. Just smoke, sizzle, and the stench of burning flesh. Screams were common. Passing out was likely. Infection? Frequent. But none of that mattered to Rome, because the pain wasn't the point. The permanence was. Branding wasn't just about individual punishment. It was about public control. You couldn't blend in anymore. Couldn't hide. Your crime became your identity. Walk into a market? They saw the mark. Try to find work? They saw the mark. Try to escape your past? The mark saw to it that you never did. And this didn't only apply to slaves and criminals. Sometimes, even soldiers, men who had sworn allegiance to the empire, were branded for minor offenses. Disobedience, cowardice, or sometimes just to mark their unit. Their identity. The Romans even branded gladiators. Letters like SP for spectaculi marked them as property of the arena. Entertainment, not citizens. Their bodies were walking billboards, flesh turned to parchment. And let's talk about the social consequences. A branded person was barely a person anymore. They were treated as dangerous, contagious, untouchable. It was a way of socially murdering someone without taking their life. Exile without leaving town. Even worse, branding was often done in tandem with other punishments. You might be beaten first, then branded, then forced to wear a chain, or sent to the mines, or paraded through the streets. A mark of pain followed by a sentence of suffering. And unlike modern tattoos, this wasn't some stylish ink. These were angry, ragged scars, burned deep and uneven, done quickly, not cleanly. Sometimes, they had to be rebranded if they faded, just in case anyone forgot. Some tried to remove them, searing them again in hopes of erasing the mark. Others cut into their own flesh to blur the letters. But it rarely worked. The scar tissue told its own story. You could run, but you couldn't unbrand yourself. And here's the kicker. Rome didn't even consider this a severe punishment. It was routine, administrative, a notation on a body, just another line item on the scroll. In the eyes of Roman law, you weren't a person with dignity. You were a thing with a label, like merchandise, like livestock, labeled, tracked, and broken. The real horror of branding wasn't just the pain. It was the future it stole from you. The way it turned every street into a reminder. Every glance, a condemnation. Every day, another repetition of your worst moment. So next time someone says, wearing your mistake on your sleeve, remember, in Rome, you wore on your face. And there was no hiding it. But the Romans weren't done mutilating those who spoke out. In fact, if you dared speak the wrong words at the wrong time, if your voice challenged the wrong authority, they had a much darker sentence prepared. Up next, tongue removal. Where Rome didn't argue with dissenters, it simply silenced them. Permanently. Section 11. You've seen how Rome punished the body. Carving, branding, tearing. But what about the voice? What about words that challenged the regime, blasphemed the gods, or simply said too much? In a society obsessed with control, speech was power, and power, in Rome, was always dangerous. So what did the empire do when someone refused to shut up? It cut out their tongue. Yes, you heard that right. Literal tongue removal. Not as metaphor, not as exaggeration, as state-sanctioned mutilation. A punishment as precise as it was horrific. Rome didn't always need grand arenas or flaming tunics to make a statement. Sometimes, all it took was a scalpel and silence. Let's break it down. The crimes that could get you silenced were many. Blasphemy, slander, treasonous speech, false testimony, seditious rumors, even satire. That's right. If your jokes went too far, your tongue could be the price. Rome loved its playwrights and poets until they crossed the line. Take, for example, the case of satirists. These were writers who mocked the powerful with wit so sharp it could cut marble. One wrong line, one perceived insult against the emperor, the gods, or the Senate, and you weren't just blacklisted. You were physically dismantled. In some instances, you were paraded first, gagged, then taken to a platform or public square. A surgeon, often not a trained one, mind you, would hold you down. Tools were crude. Sharp iron hooks, long tweezers, curved blades. And then came the removal. There were two main methods. The first, complete extraction. The tongue was pulled forward, clamped, and sliced from the root. Fast, brutal, messy. Blood poured. Nerves severed. The victim's screams collapsed into gurgling. The second, partial slicing. Just enough to ruin articulation. You could still eat, still breathe, but your words? Garbled, useless, like being trapped inside your own throat. This version was often reserved for those considered lesser threats, too dangerous to speak, not dangerous enough to kill. The result? Instant isolation, social exile. In a culture built on rhetoric and oratory, the loss of speech was civil death. Think about it. Roman society worshipped language. Senators debated endlessly. Lawyers built careers on persuasive speech. Poets immortalized heroes with verse. To speak was to exist. To speak well was to rise. And to lose your voice? That was erasure. This punishment wasn't just about silencing. It was about humiliation. You became a living cautionary tale. People saw you hobbling through the forum, jaw misshapen, mouth stitched or scarred. They knew, and they remembered. And here's the darker twist. Sometimes the punishment wasn't carried out by the state directly. It was done under imperial suggestion. The emperor wouldn't say, cut his tongue out. He'd say, this one speaks dangerously. The message was clear. The result, inevitable. And if you think this was only used on the poor or powerless, think again. Nobles were silenced. Senators, too. Anyone who got too bold. Even philosophers. One false step in a public speech, one too clever phrase in a letter, and your mouth could be the next to bleed. There's a haunting irony here. Rome loved speech, but only the kind that upheld its image. Praise the emperor, sing the glory of conquest, and you were golden. But criticize, even gently, that was enough to invite mutilation. Some victims tried to resist. There are records of men biting off their own tongues in prison, spitting them at their accusers, defiant to the bitter end. But they were rare. Most, broken, silenced. And once you lost your tongue, there were no appeals. No comeback tours. You were finished. A speaker without sound. A poet without voice. A cautionary shadow. So next time someone says, watch your mouth, remember, in Rome, they meant it literally. Speech had a cost, and sometimes the bill came in blood. But even that wasn't the end. Because for Rome, destroying speech was only one level of horror. What if they wanted to destroy your entire body, piece by piece, joint by joint? What if death came not from lions or cliffs, but from a wheel, spun not for fortune, but for fracture? Coming up next, the breaking wheel, where pain wasn't just punishment, it was art. Section 12. By now, you've seen what Rome could do to the disobedient, the defiant, the disgraceful. You've seen humiliation, mutilation, and forced silence. But there's a punishment that goes beyond all of them. One that's not about sending a quick message or producing a public death. This is a slow burn, a methodical, agonizing masterpiece of destruction. It doesn't just kill the body, it dismantles it. Welcome to the breaking wheel. Let's be precise. The breaking wheel, or simply the wheel, wasn't invented by the Romans, but they elevated it. They made it more than torture. They made it ritual. A brutal ballet of bone and blood, carried out with deliberate precision. This wasn't rage. This was order, violence in its most calculated form. It began with the accused, often someone guilty of murder, sacrilege, or rebellion. A crime so vile the state felt execution alone wasn't enough. The message had to last. And so, the condemned was stripped, tied, stretched across a flat surface, sometimes in the center of a public square. The wheel loomed beside them, wooden, massive, rimmed with iron in later versions. Now came the preparation, limbs splayed, wrists and ankles fixed. And then, the iron bar. This bar, sometimes a hammer, sometimes a mallet, wasn't for killing. Not immediately. It was for breaking, one bone at a time. Executioners started at the limbs. Ankles first, then shins, knees, thighs, arms, elbows, wrists, one after the other. Methodically, clean fractures were avoided. They wanted shattering. They wanted the bones to splinter, the limbs to twist unnaturally. The condemned didn't die from the pain. They didn't die quickly at all. In some cases, victims were kept alive for hours. In rare extremes, asterisk days star, a wheel was propped up vertically after the breaking, and the mangled body was threaded through the spokes. Like human yarn, head tilted unnaturally, limbs hanging in grotesque curves. It was here, exposed to the elements, that the real execution began, not from steel but from time. Birds arrived. Insects. The sun beat down. The cold of night crept in. Some prisoners were given water to prolong the torment. Others were left to rot. But let's not pretend this was only about physical suffering. The wheel was symbolic. In Roman culture, the circle often represented fate, eternity, cycles. To die on a wheel was to be trapped in an unending loop of agony, your body twisted into something no longer human. And for the crowd, it was mesmerizing. Spectacle, a reminder that Rome didn't just punish. It transformed, flesh into warning, bone into law. Some versions of the punishment included a final mercy blow, a crushing strike to the chest or head, delivered once the limbs were broken. But this mercy wasn't guaranteed. It depended on the mood of the crowd, the will of the magistrate, or the whim of the executioner. Sometimes the wheel was set above a fire, a slow roast. Other times, nails or spikes were added to the rim, digging deeper into torn flesh. In rare cases, the wheel was spun while the victim was still alive, bones grinding against wood and gravity. And what happened afterward? That was perhaps the most haunting part. The wheel, still threaded with body, was left on display. For hours, days, even weeks. A carcass baked into the sky, slowly turning with the wind. You didn't just die. You hung. As a lesson, a warning, a permanent scar on the skyline. There are records of citizens walking past these wheels, shielding their children's eyes. Others paused to pray, to whisper insults, to spit. For some, it was penance. For others, theater. And for the condemned, it was obliteration. No funeral, no burial, no marker, just bones bent into unnatural shapes. A skeleton wrapped around wood, remembered not by name, but by shape. It's tempting to think of the wheel as an outlier, something too barbaric, too theatrical. But in Rome, the line between justice and cruelty was always thin. And the wheel? It existed precisely at that edge. So the next time you hear someone talk about breaking someone on the wheel, remember, in ancient Rome, that wasn't a metaphor. It was a profession, a craft, an art form of agony. But if you think the wheel was the most disturbing death Rome devised, prepare yourself. Because up next, we abandon the arena, the stake, and the blade. Now, death comes not from weapon or beast, but from ash. Suffocating, scorching, and slow. A punishment designed to bury you while you're still breathing. Section 13. So far, we've seen men broken on wheels, branded as beasts, and fed to the roar of wild crowds. But now we enter a quieter form of Roman execution. Not quieter in suffering, asterisk never that asterisk, but quieter in spectacle. Here, death doesn't roar or scream. It whispers. It settles. It suffocates. Welcome to one of Rome's most obscure and terrifying methods of punishment, death by hot ash. You won't find this one dramatized in Hollywood epics. It doesn't involve swords or lions or flames licking at a pyre. Instead, it's a method that feels more psychological, more suffocating, less about performance, and more about control. Because this wasn't just death, it was burial while breathing. The setup was deceptively simple. A pit, or a large chamber, stone-lined, sometimes natural, sometimes carved. Into this space, a prisoner was led or thrown. The crime? Varies. Sometimes it was murder, sometimes sacrilege, but more often, it was political. The kind of crime that didn't just threaten lives, but Rome's sense of order. And for that, death had to be absolute. Not just of the body, but of the identity. So, the victim waits in this stone pit. And then, slowly, from above, guards begin to pour hot ash. Not molten metal, not fire. Ash. Fine. Powdery. Gray. And heated until it burned. Not with flames, but with searing friction. A river of dead fire. And the horror? It doesn't kill you all at once. It creeps. The ash pours slowly, constantly. It fills the space around you. It coats your skin. It gets into your eyes, your ears, your mouth. Try to breathe, and you inhale it. Cough, and it multiplies. The more you struggle, the more ash you breathe. It clogs your throat. your lungs. Every gasp is a punishment. And because it's hot, heated before pouring, it scorches as it smothers. Your skin burns, but not fast. Not like fire. It's more like being boiled without water. Slow, grinding, torturous. There's no escape, no foothold. The pit is too deep, the walls too slick, the ash too thick. Every motion buries you deeper. Every cry mutes itself in the gray. This was Rome's message. Asterisk, we don't even need weapons to kill you. We'll kill you with the remnants of fire. Asterisk. And the symbolism? Haunting. Ash in Roman culture represented destruction, but also purification. Temples used it in rituals. It marked ends and beginnings. So to be killed by ash was to be erased, rendered null, turned from person to dust. Asterisk, literally star. Some scholars suggest this punishment was used as a kind of final lesson for political enemies. You try to rise? We bury you in what remains of our fire. The ashes of Rome itself become your coffin. There are scattered references to this method, never glorified, always hushed. One alleged case involved a corrupt official accused of betraying the Senate. Rather than execute him in the forum, which might draw sympathy or protest, they buried him in ash. No speech, no crowd, just whispers, gray silence. And unlike crucifixion or decimation, this wasn't public. There were no cheers, no audience, just guards, a sealed chamber, and a man trying to scream through a storm of dust. What makes this punishment so terrifying is its psychology. There's no blood, no visible wound, just slow suffocation. You don't know when it will end. You don't know how deep the ash is. You can't tell if you're still alive or dreaming. It's disorienting, claustrophobic, like being buried alive, but in fire's shadow. And the final horror? When it's over, your body is gone, consumed. There's no corpse, no burial, just ash and ash. Your remains indistinguishable from your execution. Rome loved this. They relished it, because this wasn't just punishment, it was erasure. The state didn't kill you. It removed you, quietly, completely. So the next time someone uses the phrase, turn to ash, remember that in Rome, it wasn't poetic. It was policy. But even this is not Rome's most theatrical death. Because next, we set you on fire, but not all at once. We dress you for it. We prepare you. We turn you into a performance before you even light the match. Coming up, the tunica molesta, where your wardrobe is your execution, and the show starts the moment you put it on. Section 14. We've seen Rome punish with silence, with fire's ashes, with wheels and iron and gravity. But now we turn to a punishment that was deliberately designed to be a performance. Something theatrical, something slow, something terrifying not just to endure, but to watch. This was not death as an accident, or even as justice. This was death as entertainment. And the costume? The tunica molesta, the molten tunic. Sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? Like something a doomed, tragic hero would wear in an old play. But make no mistake, there was no poetry in the tunica molesta. Just fire, skin, screaming, and the slow, sizzling march toward death. Here's how it worked. The condemned, usually arsonists, traitors, or enemies of the state, were taken into custody. Sometimes paraded, sometimes dragged. There was no mistaking their fate, because this wasn't a quick execution. It was choreographed. They were forced to strip. Then, in full view of a gathered crowd, they were dressed in the tunic. But this wasn't cotton or wool. This was linen, soaked in pitch, resin, wax, or other flammable substances. It clung to the body. Every wrinkle, every fold, a fuse waiting to ignite. Then, when the time came, when the crowd had gathered and the stage was set, someone struck a torch, and the person wearing the tunica molesta became the fire. It didn't explode in an instant. This wasn't a movie. It burned in waves. First the hem, then the sleeves, then the chest. The flame traveled like a vengeful spirit, licking upward, feeding on wax and pitch and human flesh. The victim became a torch, asterisk alive, asterisk screaming, thrashing, a living effigy. They would often try to run, stumble, collapse. Their hands might flail, attempting to strip off the tunic. But it was too late. The fire wasn't just on them, it was part of them, bound to their skin by the very design of the cloth. And Rome loved every second of it, because the tunica molesta was more than a punishment, it was a message, especially for arsonists. You burned our buildings, our homes, our temples, then you burn, publicly, painfully, poetically, in the exact material you try to destroy. And the setting mattered. These executions often took place in the arena or on raised platforms in public forums. Not hidden, not rushed. Rome didn't want you to hear about the tunica molesta. It wanted you to see it, smell it, feel the heat radiating off the stage. Hear the shrieks ricochet between columns. Death wasn't private in Rome. It was pedagogy. Sometimes the tunic was paired with other humiliations. A crown of thorns, a signboard hung from the neck, words scrawled in ash across the chest. The tunic wasn't just fire, it was a uniform of shame. And don't think this was only for the lower classes. Rome believed no one was above theatrical death. Senators, generals, even minor royalty. If the crime was great enough and the message had to be sent, anyone could be wrapped in the tunica molesta. And the fire? It didn't stop at the tunic. As the pitch burned through the cloth, it fused the skin, melted it, turned limbs into dripping black shapes. The pain was excruciating, the death inevitable, and the audience? Captivated. Because that was the point. Rome didn't just punish, it taught. Every public death was a lecture. Every scream, a footnote. Every flame, a warning. This punishment wasn't just ancient cruelty. It was calculated, institutionalized, and standardized. Historians record its use under emperors like Nero, who, of course, had a reputation for turning executions into art. He allegedly staged entire rows of condemned men wearing the tunica molesta, lighting them one by one, as human torches to illuminate his garden parties. Yes, garden parties. Imagine sipping wine while a line of burning men flicker in the distance. That was Rome at its most theatrical and its most terrifying. But there's one more layer to this nightmare. Some scholars argue that the tunica molesta had religious significance, that it mirrored punishments in Roman myth, like the flammable robe given to Hercules, which consumed him alive. That it wasn't just punishment, it was ritual retribution. A mortal trying to play God, burn like a false prophet. Whether symbolic or sadistic, the effect was the same. The tunica molesta didn't just kill. It transformed. It turned people into flames, into warnings, into whispers that echoed in the minds of those who watched, long after the ashes cooled. But even that wasn't enough for Rome. Because what if even death wasn't the worst punishment? What if the worst fate wasn't to be tortured, but to be forgotten? Coming up next, damnatio memoriae, the punishment where your body might survive, but your existence would be erased. Your name, your face, your legacy, gone. Section 15. After witnessing Rome burn its enemies alive in tunics, soaked with pitch and wax, after screams and flames faded into black smoke, it's hard to imagine a fate more brutal. But the Romans understood something most societies never truly grasp. Sometimes, death isn't the worst punishment. Sometimes, the most devastating sentence isn't pain, or blood, or fire. Asterisk its oblivion star. Enter damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. This punishment wasn't about mutilating your body. It wasn't about tormenting your limbs or silencing your voice. It was about something deeper, something more eternal. Your identity, your legacy, your place in history. Because in a culture obsessed with glory, lineage, and eternal fame, what could be worse than dying? Being erased. Damnatio memoriae was the ultimate Roman cancellation. It didn't just remove you from power, it removed you from existence. Your statues? Smashed. Your name? Chiseled off monuments. Your portraits? Destroyed. Your legal decrees? Voided. Coins with your image? Melted. It was as if Rome itself was trying to rewind time and say, you were never here. And it was terrifyingly effective. Let's say you were an emperor who fell out of favor. Maybe you ruled with cruelty. Maybe you were accused of treason or madness. Or maybe the next emperor simply didn't like you. After your death, or even before, you could be declared damnatus memoriae by the Senate or your political enemies. Immediately, teams were dispatched. Your statues were decapitated or defaced. Marble busts had their eyes gouged out, lips scraped away. Wall carvings were recarved. Your name replaced with a neutral phrase like the former one, or simply left blank. Public records were altered. Your birthday? No longer a holiday. Your achievements? Reassigned to someone else. Your descendants? Shamed, sometimes exiled. You weren't just forgotten. You were unwritten. And in a culture where legacy was immortality, this was hell. Romans believed strongly in fama, the idea that to be remembered was to live forever. Their poets, generals, and emperors built monuments and empires not just for power, but to etch their names into eternity. So to be subjected to damnatio memoriae was to be denied a second life. No tomb, no inscription, no prayer, just absence. Take Geta, for example, co-emperor with his brother Caracalla. After Caracalla had him murdered, he didn't stop there. He declared damnatio memoriae. Geta's name was erased from all public records. Over 20,000 inscriptions were ordered edited or destroyed. His images were scraped out of frescoes. His face erased from family portraits. In one surviving painting, you can still see it, two brothers standing side by side, except one figure has no face, no name, just a hollow outline. Geta became the ghost of history. And this didn't just happen to emperors, senators, generals, public figures. Anyone deemed dangerous to Rome's narrative could be erased. And once it began, there was no undoing it. To resist was treason. To speak their name was taboo. Even family members were forbidden to mourn them openly. The silence was complete. And it worked. There are names we will never know. Achievements lost. Stories fragmented. People who shaped Rome, buried not in tombs, but in non-existence. But here's the great irony. The very act of erasing someone often made them more mysterious, more studied. Modern historians pore over scratched-off inscriptions, trace damaged busts, and examine altered manuscripts. In trying to delete people, Rome inadvertently made them immortal, asterisk as erasure's star. Still, the horror remains. Imagine being stripped of your place in time. Your name no longer spoken. Your face no longer recognized. Your words no longer remembered. You don't even get to be a villain in history. You get nothing. And for Romans, men raised to believe that glory after death was the highest form of life. Asterisk nothingness asterisk was the ultimate punishment. So the next time someone says history will remember you, remember, in ancient Rome, history could choose not to. No flame, no whip, no lion, just silence. But before we conclude this journey through the darkness of Roman justice, there's one more punishment to examine. One last device of dread. Not philosophical, not theatrical, just raw, physical pain delivered through sheer, relentless agony. Coming up, the wooden horse, a saddle of splinters and blood, where your flesh becomes the price of disobedience, and the ride never ends until your body breaks. Section 16. So far, we've seen punishment through spectacle, through silence, through fire and forgetfulness. But now we return to something more immediate, something physical, something that doesn't rely on metaphor or theater or memory. This next punishment is all about pain. No symbolism, no political intrigue, just a body, a sharp edge, and gravity doing its work. Prepare yourself for the wooden horse, one of the most sadistic torture devices ever used by ancient Rome. Now, don't confuse this with the wooden donkey from earlier. That one was a humiliation device, a public punishment designed for shame and agony. But the wooden horse? That was a weapon, a tool of flesh-ripping violence used to make an example out of rebels, disobedient soldiers, or those accused of subversion. Picture it, a tall, narrow wooden beam, sharpened along the top edge until it forms a ridge like the back of a knife. This is the horse, and it's not meant for riding, not in any ordinary sense. The condemned is stripped naked, then hoisted up and made to straddle the beam, with legs dangling uselessly on either side. At first, the pain is sharp, uncomfortable, then unbearable. Because the edge isn't flat, it's razor thin, and your entire weight is pressing your groin and thighs down onto that blade-like surface. And if that wasn't enough, Rome rarely let gravity do all the work alone. Weights were added: heavy stones, iron chains, buckets of sand, anything that could be tied to the ankles and pulled downward. The more you resisted, squirmed, screamed, begged, the more weight they added. Your skin split, muscle tore, ligaments stretched. The beam didn't just bruise, it sliced. The pain was total, not a stab or a cut or a burn, but a long, slow tear. The body's most sensitive regions, pressed into a sharpened edge, pulled down by their own mass. It wasn't designed to kill you fast. In fact, it often didn't kill at all, at least not immediately. It crippled. Some victims passed out from blood loss. Some developed infections days later. Others lived, but could never walk again. The injuries inflicted by the wooden horse were often permanent. Deliberately so, because in Rome, a broken body was as much a warning as a dead one. And it wasn't always done in private. Much like the donkey, the wooden horse was sometimes used in public forums, placed high on a stage, or on mobile carts, made to roll through markets or military camps. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a procession, a parade of pain. In military settings, commanders used the wooden horse to punish disobedience, desertion, or cowardice. Soldiers were made to ride the device in full view of their comrades. No one stepped in. No one helped. Because helping? That was treason. And the message? Crystal clear. Fall in line, or we'll splinter you from the inside out. There were even variations of the horse, some with metal spikes embedded in the edge, others soaked in oil and set alight beneath the victim's legs. Because in Rome, cruelty wasn't just a means to an end. It was an evolving craft. Women were not spared from this fate either, especially those accused of adultery or political betrayal. They were paraded, straddled, broken, and in many cases discarded afterward. Not just physically destroyed, but socially erased. And here's the darkest part. There were no rules. The length of time a person remained on the horse, arbitrary. The weight added, random. The reason for the punishment, sometimes just a rumor, a whisper, a command. There was no defense, no appeal, just the edge, and your body giving way to it. So why use it? Because Rome knew what fear looked like. It knew that blood dries and names fade. But pain, visible, real, raw pain, that lingers. In the minds of onlookers, in the limping survivor, in the stories whispered in alleyways and army tents. The wooden horse was a tool of memory, a device to burn the lesson into the flesh of a population. And if you think it ended with Rome, think again. The concept of the horse continued into medieval Europe, colonial punishment, and even early modern warfare. Its simplicity made it portable, adaptable, eternal, because when a civilization perfects pain, that legacy doesn't die. And now, as we descend in the final chapters of this tour through Roman cruelty, you might wonder, could it possibly get worse? What happens when a punishment combines psychological destruction and physical agony? When you're not just maimed or killed, but turned into an example so horrific that others don't even want to speak your name. In the next section, we return to branding, but this time with a face and voice erased and a soul locked inside public shame. The final stages of Rome's most grotesque theater await. Section 17. You've now walked with the condemned, burned, branded, erased, flayed, and broken. Rome's punishments weren't just executions. They were messages, symbols, warnings etched into flesh, whispered through generations. But now we explore a punishment that fused all of these horrors into one. A sentence that maimed the body, silenced the voice, marked the face, and cast the soul into a living death of public shame. The kind of punishment that didn't end your life, just made sure it was no longer worth living. This is the legacy of extreme facial disfigurement and forced public exposure. A punishment rarely given a name, because the process was the name. It was shame, enforced by knife and iron, broadcast by the human body itself. Here's how it happened. You committed a crime. Not enough to be executed, but too serious to ignore. Maybe theft, maybe adultery, maybe insulting a magistrate, speaking out of turn, or crossing some political line. You didn't just break a rule, you embarrassed someone above you. And Rome? Rome hated embarrassment. So what did they do? They took the thing that gave you identity, your face, and destroyed it. First came the cutting. This could mean the removal of the nose, the ears, or the lips, depending on the crime. Sometimes just one, sometimes all three. Mutilation wasn't about the pain, it was about the symbolism. No nose, you're dishonored. No ears, you're not worth listening to. No lips, you don't deserve to speak. Next came branding, not the subtle back-of-the-hand kind. This was facial branding, often on the forehead or cheeks. Heated irons were used to press letters, words, or symbols into the skin. For thief. SACR for sacrilegious. Impious for the impious. The letters burned through muscle and nerve, leaving a raised scar, a label that never came off. And if that wasn't enough, you were forced into the public square, marched through crowded markets, put on a platform, tied to a post, a living lesson, a display. Children pointed, adults scoffed, even slaves laughed, because at least they weren't you. This wasn't torture for the sake of pain. This was reputation destruction. In Rome, honor was currency. Social status was everything. You could be a poor man with honor and still be respected. But once your face was marked, asterisk, permanently disfigured asterisk, you lost everything. You weren't just shamed, you were unredeemable. And what made it worse? You were left alive, left to walk the streets, to attempt work, to seek food, housing, help, with a face that told everyone, I failed Rome. You were a ghost of your former self. Not dead, but worse, asterisk known star. In some cases, people fled, changed their names, moved to distant provinces, hid in slums or among the enslaved. But the scars always gave them away. You couldn't run from your own skin. Others tried to mutilate themselves further, hoping to disfigure the brand beyond recognition. But the attempt only deepened the shame. If your face didn't match the records, the punishment was repeated, this time with more letters. More pain, more permanence. Women, too, suffered this punishment, especially those accused of adultery or prostitution. A branded woman could not remarry, could not testify, could not walk without stairs. Her face wasn't just a symbol, it was a prison. And the most chilling part? There was no time limit. This wasn't 5 years or 10, or until your debt was repaid. This was forever. A punishment that walked with you, slept with you, reflected back at you every time you found a bucket of water to see your face. Rome believed that pain faded, but reputation destruction, that stuck. And they were right. Even today, archaeologists have unearthed Roman skulls with unmistakable branding scars, statues with the names chiseled out, evidence of faces once known, now scrubbed, scarred, erased. But some tried to reclaim their stories. A few, branded unfairly, became martyrs or folk heroes. Their scars became symbols of defiance, of standing up to empire. But those were exceptions. For most, the face became a curse, a lifetime sentence without chains. So the next time someone says face the consequences, remember, Rome meant that literally. With iron, with flame, with the irreversible ruin of your very identity. And still, we are not finished. Because while some are burned, broken, or buried, others were staged, put in costumes, sent to die, performing their punishment. Rome loved a good death, but Rome worshipped a good show. Coming up next, the final spectacle, where mythology, murder, and punishment combined in gruesome, unforgettable theater. Where you didn't just die for the crime, you acted it out, scene by bloody scene. Section 18. We've seen Rome burn people alive in tunics, soaked with pitch. We've seen it carve shame into faces and break bones with precision. But now, we step into Rome's most sinister stage. A punishment that fused mythology, theater, execution, and propaganda. Where the condemned didn't just die, they performed their own death. Welcome to the theatrical execution, the final act in Rome's long tradition of turning death into a spectacle. Rome didn't invent theatrical punishment, but it perfected it. Let's start with what it was. In certain festivals, particularly during the Ludi, the grand public games held to entertain the masses, executions weren't just carried out. They were staged as dramatic reenactments. Myths, legends, tales of gods and monsters. Except the roles weren't played by actors. They were filled by condemned prisoners. You were given a role. Prometheus, Orpheus, Icarus, Hercules. And you were told very clearly what was going to happen. Let's say you were cast as Prometheus. You'd be tied to a rock, your chest exposed. And while a mechanical eagle, sometimes even a trained bird of prey, descended, the real punishment began. Your liver was torn out. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. A real, bloody evisceration in front of a cheering crowd. Or maybe you were Icarus. You'd be strapped with wax wings, lifted on a primitive pulley system over the arena floor, and dropped from a fatal height. The audience applauded. They'd seen the myth play out. They'd also seen a man die. And here's the truly Roman twist. These shows were billed as entertainment, not punishment. They weren't listed on programs as executions. They were part of the drama, a segment of the day's festivities. You'd have chariot races in the morning, beast hunts in the afternoon, and mythological killings to close out the show. Real deaths, real blood, real bodies, but dressed up as storytelling. The most infamous of these came under Emperor Nero, a man known for blending art, cruelty, and egomania in equal parts. Nero didn't just authorize theatrical executions. He composed them, directed them, added music. Sometimes he even performed alongside the dying. The emperor as actor, god, and executioner all in one. Under his reign, Christians were often used in these spectacles, cast as characters from pagan legends, always roles that ended in death. Nero would have them dressed as mythic figures and then burned, crucified, or mauled at the climax of the play. The point wasn't just punishment, it was mockery of their beliefs, of their defiance, of the idea that their suffering might mean anything. One infamous example, the story of Dirce, a mythological queen tied to a bull and dragged to death. In the Roman version, a condemned woman played Dirce. She was stripped, tied to a wild bull in the arena, and released. The animal dragged her body until bones snapped, muscles tore, and the blood painted the sand. The crowd? Delighted. It's important to understand, these weren't rare occurrences. They were scheduled, rehearsed, and repeated. A standard part of public games in the late Empire. Execution as narrative. The costumes were elaborate. The sets complex. Wooden ships might be built to reenact a naval myth, only to be set on fire mid-show, with prisoners locked inside. Even the animals had roles. Lions, leopards, elephants. Each one trained, provoked to play their part. And the victims? They knew exactly what was coming. Sometimes they were forced to rehearse, told the story, shown the props. Their part wasn't just to die, it was to die correctly, to hit their marks. This wasn't death as justice. It was death as opera. And why did Rome do it? Because it worked. It thrilled the public, reinforced power, made the law feel divine. People didn't leave the arena afraid of punishment. They left entertained by it, desensitized, even eager for more. Theatrical execution blurred the line between punishment and art, between death and fiction, between criminal and character. And in doing so, it turned the worst horrors into tradition. The condemned weren't just prisoners. They were actors in a state-produced morality play. Their pain was the climax. Their last breath, the final scene. And Rome? It applauded. This was the final evolution of Roman punishment. Not just killing the body, not just erasing the name, but turning a life into a narrative, one that ended on cue, with the right lighting and the perfect script. So when we talk about Rome's cruelty, don't just think of lions or crosses or cliffs. Think of audiences clapping, of children watching, of the state writing the final act, and handing the script to the man who was about to die. But we're not done yet. In the next section, we reflect on everything we've seen, every method, every scream, every silence. And we ask the final question, what was Rome really trying to say? What does this long symphony of suffering tell us about power, punishment, and control? Section 19. We've marched through ash and fire, watched bodies split on wheels, lives erased from stone, faces marked with red-hot iron. We've seen death turned into spectacle, memory turned into punishment, and punishment turned into theater. So now, after 17 chapters of Rome's darkest rituals, we step back and ask, what does it all mean? Why did Rome, the cradle of law, civilization, and empire, invest so much time, energy, and creativity in cruelty? The answer is as brutal as the punishments themselves. Rome understood something chillingly simple. Fear sustains empires. You see, Roman law wasn't built only to protect. It was built to control. And punishment wasn't just about deterrence. It was about creating visible, physical consequences for invisible crimes. A breach in loyalty? Burn them. A whisper of betrayal? Erase them. A failed escape? Brand them. Disobey the gods? Bury them. Question the emperor? Perform your death for a crowd. Every method we've covered had two targets: the body of the condemned and the mind of the public. Let's go back. The Vestal virgins, buried alive for breaking vows, not because they harmed anyone, but because the idea of their impurity threatened Rome's sacred order. The punishment wasn't for justice. It was for cosmic balance. Pena Culiae, the sack with animals, wasn't just a punishment for parricide. It was a ritual of symbolic chaos. A murderer of the father, the root of Roman order, was swallowed by nature's madness. Snake, dog, monkey, rooster, drowned in noise, teeth, and writhing forms. The story mattered more than the death. Then we had crucifixion, the most iconic Roman execution. A punishment so cruel, so slow, it turned rebels into breathing billboards. Not only did it kill the body, it killed hope. A man hanging for days reminded every passerby, this is what happens when you cross the line. And then there's decimation, the most psychologically vicious punishment of them all. The killing of 1 in 10. Not by executioners, but by your own comrades. Rome didn't just punish disobedience, it engineered mistrust. A legion afraid to disobey wasn't half as effective as a legion afraid of itself. What about branding? Or facial disfigurement? Or tongue removal? Rome didn't just aim to end a person's future, it made sure they had no past. No legacy. A man with a scar across his face told a silent story that everyone understood. A woman branded with adultera didn't need a trial. Her skin was the verdict. Even the tunica molesta, death by burning tunic, wasn't just a public execution. It was a stage play. Rome knew how to weaponize pageantry. When Nero lit Christians on fire as human torches in his garden, he wasn't punishing faith. He was creating a myth of imperial power. And at the end of it all, damnatio memoriae, the cleanest, most final punishment. No blood, no bruises, just nothing. Erasure so complete. You were not only forgotten, you were never born. So what was the point? Why did an empire that built aqueducts, roads, calendars, and literature also build the most complex system of suffering in history? Because Rome knew that spectacle is memory. We remember the burning tunic, the screaming at the wheel, the sack of beasts, the eagle tearing Prometheus apart. Rome knew that fear was cultural glue, that people wouldn't remember obscure laws, but they'd remember the man who screamed as his legs were torn apart on a sharp beam. They'd remember the merchant whose branded face told them, don't steal. They'd remember the silence when a senator's name vanished from every wall overnight. And perhaps the most Roman truth of all, they liked it. The crowd, the applause, the laughter, the moments where someone else's pain proved the strength of the state. It wasn't just punishment, it was participation, a shared ritual of obedience. Rome turned its worst cruelty into routine, into policy, into tradition, into law, and then into legend. Because that's the final irony. We sit here now, thousands of years later, remembering the very people Rome tried to erase. We study their broken bones. We read their scratched-out names. We trace the outlines of their pain through marble and parchment and iron. And in doing so, we remember that power, when unchecked, always finds new ways to punish, new ways to perform. New ways to erase. Asterisk, asterisk. Rome's punishments were never just about death. They were about control, narrative, permanence. And if that doesn't terrify you, you weren't paying attention. But we have one last step left. Coming up in our final section, after the blood, the branding, the silence, and the fire, we ask the question, what made these punishments possible? What cultural ideas allowed such cruelty to become normalized? And what can we learn from the psychology of Roman justice, even today? Let's end where it all begins, the human mind. Section 20. We've seen the instruments, the flames, the wheels, the screams. We've explored every cut Rome etched into the bodies of its enemies and the silence it imposed on their legacies. But now, at the end of this long and brutal road, it's time to ask the final question. How did a society known for law, reason, and order justify such monstrous punishments? The answer lies in the psychology of Roman justice. Because Rome wasn't just an empire of roads and columns. It was an empire of ideas. And at the heart of those ideas was a belief that pain, when ritualized, sustained civilization. Let's break that down. Rome's justice system wasn't designed to rehabilitate. There were no prisons meant to reform. No second chances waiting behind courtroom doors. Instead, Rome embraced a philosophy of retributive justice. You harm the state harms you. Asterisk in public asterisk, in full view, and forever. Rome didn't stop at punishment. It took it a step further. It moralized cruelty. Every punishment we've explored wasn't just violence. It was wrapped in virtue. The execution of a rebel, that was loyalty in action. The branding of a thief, justice made visible. The erasure of a name, restoration of cosmic order. Rome didn't say, we're cruel because we can. It said, we're cruel because we must be. That's what made it so terrifying. Because it wasn't bloodlust driving these punishments, it was reason. They were debated, drafted into law, given to magistrates, and codified in scrolls. The 12 tables, the lex talionis, the digest of Justinian. Pain was made legal, predictable, structured, and that structure did something profound. It turned violence into culture. The people accepted it, not just accepted, endorsed it. Crowds cheered as men were branded, laughed as others were torn by beasts, toasted as flames devoured heretics in their tunics. This wasn't the behavior of monsters. These were ordinary people, trained from childhood to see pain as civic order, to see execution not as horror, but as spectacle. And at the heart of it all, fear. Rome controlled vast territories, peoples, languages, and religions. It needed a glue stronger than borders, stronger than law. And that glue was fear. Carefully choreographed, deliberately designed state violence. Delivered just often enough, just publicly enough to keep the gears turning. Because when you saw your neighbor's face branded, you thought twice before stealing grain. When you saw your cousin's name carved off a wall, you thought twice before mocking the emperor. When you passed a man crucified on a hill, you remembered what happened to rebels. Rome's genius was not just in roads or war or law, but in its ability to create a shared language of terror. It made pain legible, symbolic, digestible, even artful. And here's the part that hits hardest. It worked. Rome lasted over 1,000 years. Not in spite of these punishments, but because of them. The rituals, the repetition, the culture of obedience, the narrative of law, they formed the skeleton of the empire. But now, centuries later, we can see the truth. That skeleton was built from bones. So what do we take away? We remember that cruelty doesn't start with monsters. It starts with ideas, with systems, with stories about order, about justice, about necessity. Rome didn't punish people because they were evil. Rome punished because it told itself that suffering keeps the peace. And history has a funny way of recycling that lie. Look around today. Modern systems still brand people. Digitally, socially, culturally. Still silence voices. Still erase names. Still perform justice more for spectacle than substance. The tools are newer. The scripts are different. But the logic? Frighteningly familiar. That's why we study Rome. Not because it's ancient, but because it's a mirror, and in its mirror, we see the machinery of control laid bare, visible violence as invisible order. So if you've made it through this journey, through the ash, the fire, the silence, and the blade, remember this. Rome fell, but the idea of Rome's justice never did. It lives on in every system that turns punishment into performance, in every courtroom that values order over humanity, in every law that prioritizes fear over fairness. We close not with a scream, but with a silence deeper than any pit, darker than any cell. The silence of a world that normalized pain. And in that silence, we are left with a choice. Repeat the story, or write a new one. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey through history as haunting and illuminating as we did, hit that subscribe button, share the video, and let us know your thoughts below. There's more history where this came from, but only if you want it. Sleep well, if you can.